Well, what can I do? Anyway, the reason people started to ask me to give talks is because of my work on the free software movement. But this talk is not about the free software movement. This is about a follow-on question that people would ask me at the end of my talks about free software, and even still do. But in order for it to make sense, I better say a little bit about what free software means. Free software means software that respects the user's freedom and the social solidarity of the user's community. So it's free as in freedom. We're not talking about price. This isn't gratis software, it's freedom respecting software. To understand the concept of free software, think of free as in free speech, not free as in free beer. Software which is not free is called non-free software, proprietary software, user-subjugating software. It keeps users divided and helpless. Divided because they're forbidden to share it, and helpless because they don't get the source code, so they can't change it, they can't even tell what it's really doing. And often it contains intentionally implemented malicious features to do things like spy on the user, restrict the user, even attack the user. For instance, Microsoft Windows has all three kinds of malicious features, and Mac OS X has the latter two, we know. We don't know whether it spies on people. You can't check, right? Maybe it spies on people, but nobody has discovered this for certain. So, to be more specific, a program is free software if it gives you, the user, the four essential freedoms. Freedom 0 is the freedom to run the program as you wish. Freedom 1 is the freedom to study the source code and then change it to make the program do what you wish. Freedom 2 is the freedom to help your neighbor. That's the freedom to redistribute exact copies of the program when you wish. And freedom 3 is the freedom to contribute to your community. That's the freedom to distribute copies of your modified versions when you wish. Now, each of these freedoms is literally the freedom to do it if you wish. It's not a requirement. You're not, the fact that the program is free software doesn't require you to do any of these things. In fact, if it did require them, it wouldn't be free software. But the point is you should be free to do these things when you choose to. So, whether or not a program is free is not a technical question. It's not a question directly about what the program does. It's a question about the social system of the program's distribution and use. If the program is free software, that's because the social system of its distribution and use is an ethical system, one that respects the user's freedom and the social solidarity of the user's community. But if one of these freedoms is missing, that means the social system is unethical, and that's why we call it non-free software. So the existence of non-free software is a social problem, and the aim of the free software movement is to put an end to that problem. People should not be being tempted by attractive, convenient software to betray their communities and give up their freedom. It's for this motive that I launched the development of the GNU operating system, which today probably has more than 100 million users, except that most of them don't know it's the GNU system. They've been misinformed that it's the Linux system. But please don't call it that, because that means you're giving all the credit to somebody who came along later and did a smaller part of the job. It's the combination of GNU and Linux that we use, so it's the GNU plus Linux system. If you give us equal mention, we'll be content. Well, as the GNU plus Linux system started catching on in the 90s, until the mistaken idea that it was Linux caught on so much that people mostly forgot about us, I started getting invited to give more speeches. And people would ask questions like, do these same ideas apply to anything other than software? Now, usually the people who asked were wise guys. So they said, what about hardware? Should hardware be free too? Well, That's only a meaningful question if they're using the same concept of free. But let's see whether that's relevant to physical objects. Let's look at the 4 freedoms. Freedom 0 is the freedom to run the program. Well, translated to physical objects, that would be the freedom to use the object as you wish. And in general, you have that freedom. If you buy a physical product, the manufacturer doesn't put on restrictions through a license. So you're free to use it any way you like. Now, some things you might do are illegal for other reasons, but that's orthogonal. They'd be equally illegal if you were using some other objects or not using any. So that has nothing to do with this issue. So freedom 0 you've got. What about freedom 1, the freedom to study and change the source code? Well, there we run into a snag because there's normally no source code for a physical object. And so we'd have to adapt it. It could be the freedom to study and change the object itself. And in general, you have that freedom. Although the extent to which it's feasible to exercise it can be rather limited, more or less depending on the object. If you have an object made of wood, it's fairly feasible to make changes in it. If it's made of plastic or metal, it's harder. If it's a computer chip, it's impossible. Nobody can change a computer chip. If you try to rewire the little microscopic wires on the chip that you can only see with a microscope, all you do is destroy it. So you've got freedom 1 in general to the extent it's feasible, but often that's very limited. What about freedom 2, the freedom to make exact copies and redistribute them? Well, that's a meaningless question because there are no copiers for most physical objects. So usually it's not even sensible to ask the question. And likewise, freedom 3, the freedom to redistribute copies of your modified versions. If you have a physical object and you've changed it, you still don't have a copier for it. So yeah, you could make some changes in a car, say, but you still don't have a car copier. So the answer is physical objects are about as free as they could be given the technology we have. Now, someday maybe it'll be different, but today it's enough to deal with the ethical issues raised by the technology we have today. So as they asked that question, it was silly. But there are other things for which the question does make sense, namely other works made of information that you might have copies of, perhaps in your computer, and then you could use your computer to copy them and change them. So it's a very real and important question to what extent you should have those freedoms. And that, why are you turning lights off? Okay. Because there's a danger I'll fall asleep if we don't have light over here. So, and that is the topic of my talk today. Now, if you have a copy of something that's not a program that's been published, then almost always the only thing that would stop you from legally from doing any of these things, that would deny you any of these freedoms, is copyright law. So we can ask the same question from the other direction by asking, what should copyright law say about them? And that is a very important question for our freedom nowadays. To think about this question, it's useful to recognize that copyright is connected with copying technology, and the development of copyright law is connected with the development of copying technology. But I realized there was something I should have told you before that. The first step in starting to understand copyright law and any of the issues that it raises is to break the erroneous connection that has been established in many people's minds between copyright law and other totally different laws. That erroneous connection is propagated through the propaganda term, quote, intellectual property, unquote, a term that should never be used. I mean literally never. Because it not only carries bias through the word property, which encourages people to look at any issue it's applied to from the wrong basis, but even worse, because it lumps together laws that have really nothing in common, and whose practical effects are totally different, whose purposes are totally different, it encourages people to ignore the facts about any given law and not even recognize what the issues really are. So it wouldn't even be enough to replace that term by a different term. We have to delete it. Anytime someone talks about, quote, intellectual property, unquote, either he's confused or he's trying to confuse someone else. And both of them are bad. So never use the term. I won't even quote somebody else using the term, except as part of explaining why it's so harmful. Because if I quoted somebody else using the term and I didn't say it was harmful, in effect I would be implicitly treating it as a meaningful term to use. And that's exactly what confuses people. We must never say anything that suggests that that term is a meaningful term to use in your thinking. So this issue is about copyright law. It's not about patent law, which is almost totally different. It's not about trademark law, which is 100% different. It's about copyright and only copyright, because only copyright restricts copying these works made of information. Only copyright's relevant to them, except in weird cases which concern software. And even in that, the issue is a totally different issue. It has nothing to do with this. So, the history of copyright law is connected with the history of copying technology. And why are these changes in technology relevant? Because even though they can't affect our basic ethical principles, they do affect how we apply them, because we apply them by looking at the consequences of various choices. Well, changes in context can change the consequences of any given choice, unless they can make it more good or more bad. For instance, if we could reliably resurrect the dead, then murder wouldn't be such a big deal. You know, the judge would say, you killed him, you have to pay for his new body. And that would be it. In the US, we probably have to carry uninsured murderer insurance. But maybe in Canada, the National Health Service would take care of it. So, let's look at the history of copying technology. Copying began in the ancient world, where it was done with a writing instrument on a writing surface. Basically, you'd read one copy and you'd write another copy of what you read. Now, this technology was not very efficient, but it had certain other interesting characteristics. First of all, it had no economy of scale. It would take you 10 times as long to make 10 copies as to make one copy. Except, of course, if you didn't copy very often, there might be a little bit of learning curve. But that's a small effect, not important. It didn't require any special skill beyond the skill of reading and writing. And it didn't require any special equipment either, beyond the equipment for writing. As a result, copies were made in a very decentralized way. Any place that there was one copy and someone wanted to copy it, he did. Now, as far as I can tell, there was nothing like copyright in the ancient world. If you had a copy of a book and you wanted to copy it, nobody tried to stop you. Except in the case where the local ruler didn't like what the book said, in which case he might punish you horribly. But that's not exactly copyright. It's something closely related, namely censorship. And copyright to this day is often used for censorship purposes. Now, for thousands of years, but then there was a big advance in copying technology, the technology of the printing press, which made copying a lot more efficient, but not uniformly so. because the printing press was only useful if you were going to make many copies. So, in effect, this was the efficiency in the ancient world, and the printing press gave us this. Mass production copying a lot more efficient, but making one copy at a time didn't benefit at all because it was most efficient to do that by hand. Now, the printing press had an inherent economy of scale. That's why it had this kind of effect. It took a lot of work to set the type, but once that was done, you could very quickly make many identical copies. Also, the printing press was expensive equipment, the press itself and the type, which most literate people didn't have. And it required special skills to use it, very different from the skills of reading and writing. I'm not saying it was rocket science. Probably most people who learned to read and write could learn to run a press, but most of them never did. So the result was a centralized system of making copies. Copies of any book were made in a few places, and then they were transported to the places that where people wanted to buy them. In the first few centuries of printing, many copies were still made by hand, typically either on behalf of very rich people to show how rich they were, or by poor people, because, as the song goes, time ain't money if all you got is time. That song was a hit in the 1930s, and it may be popular again next year. So there were poor people who couldn't afford even to buy a printed copy, but they had the time on their hands to write copies with their hands. And a lot of copies were made this way. Now, copyright began in the age of the printing press. For instance, in Italy in the 1500s, apparently there were princes that would give you a monopoly on printing a book you wrote, especially if the book started by saying something very nice about them. Princes back then used to hand out monopolies over any sort of thing as a way to reward whoever they wished to reward, but it was a sort of custom that they would do this for authors. Copyright in England began, I believe it was under Queen Mary, as a system of censorship. So, to get permission to publish a book, one had to ask the state for permission, and this was granted as a permanent monopoly to a particular publisher. The system of censorship became obsolete, I think, after the Glorious Revolution. And people started rethinking the question of copyright. And in the 1700s, copyright was given to authors for, I believe, 14 years. And the idea developed that copyright was an artificial scheme to encourage writing. When the U.S. Constitution was written, there was a proposal that authors should be entitled to a copyright. You'd never believe this to hear what publishers say these days, but it was rejected. And instead, the U.S. Constitution made copyright optional. It was up to Congress to decide whether to have a copyright system. But if it did, the purpose was to promote progress. It was not for the sake of copyright holders, not at all. It's to promote progress, of benefit for the general public. And it has to last for a limited time. Now, around 100 years ago, printing presses became a lot more efficient, and even poor people could buy printed copies. So they stopped copying by hand. But throughout the age of the printing press, copyright was always treated as an industrial regulation, a regulation imposed on publishers in the hands of the authors, and all set up for the purpose of benefiting the reading public. Or listening public, whatever. The idea is that it would encourage people to write or make works of authorship, and the result was there would be more of them, and also there would be more conversation about important issues that might conceivably help society make up its mind about them. Because it operated as an industrial regulation, it was mostly uncontroversial, easy to enforce, and arguably beneficial. It was uncontroversial because the readers were not being restricted, so they had nothing to complain about. It was easy to enforce because it only had to be enforced really against publishers, and therefore it's easy to find out who's publishing something. You go to the bookstore and you say, where do these copies come from? You don't have to invade everybody's home or everybody's computer to do that. And finally, it was arguably beneficial because this trade, and that's what it was considered a trade made by the public, which traded away part of its natural rights and in exchange received certain benefits, the benefits of more works being made. Well, if you trade away something that's of no use to you, that you can't use, and in exchange you get something of some value to you, you have gained. Whether or not it's the best possible deal is another question, but at least it's positive for you. So, if we were still in the age of the printing press, I don't think I'd be criticizing copyright law. But the age of the printing press is gradually giving way to the age of the computer networks, another advance in copying technology, which once again makes copying much more efficient, and once again not uniformly more efficient. Here's what we had in the age of the printing press. Digital technology gives us this. So copying one copy at a time is not quite as efficient as mass production, but almost. And it's efficient enough that hundreds of millions of people want to do it and can do it. So even if the words of copyright law had not changed, what was arguably beneficial in the age of the printing press is intolerable now. Because now copyright restricts every reader. Now the publishers want to enforce it against every reader. So what we have is a restriction on the general public controlled by publishers, mostly in the name of the authors. Something completely unjust. So a democratic government that wanted to represent its citizens would, at this point, say the trade that we made, trading away the citizens' freedom, which was perfectly fine in the age of the printing press, is now intolerable. They must keep some of that freedom. We're going to have to reduce this deal. We're going to have to reclaim for our citizens the freedom that was traded away when we didn't know what was going to happen in the age of the computer networks. We can estimate the illness of democracy around the world by the tendency of governments to do the exact opposite. In fact, they are extending copyright power in every dimension. One extension is in the dimension of time. The duration of copyright has been tremendously expanded since the 1700s. So that in some cases, under the Berne Convention, it can last for up to 150 years. Now, somehow people don't think that everybody who produces a car must get a deal so that his grandchildren will be paid for that car. But bizarrely, there's the idea that authors' grandchildren should still receive a living for doing no work because of the work done by their grandfather. Well, it seems to me we should either apply it to everybody or nobody. But in any case, copyright lasts an outrageously long time, more than a human lifetime in many cases, but that doesn't satisfy the publishers. They're trying to extend it, and they're pushing these extensions all around the world. In the US in 1998, they extended copyright by 20 years on both past works and future works. Now, how they could possibly encourage more creativity on the part of the now dead authors and artists of the 20s and 30s by extending their copyrights now is beyond me. If they have a time machine, apparently they have not used it because our histories don't record that there was a tremendous burst of creativity once everybody found out that their copyrights would be extended 70 years in the future. They failed to inform those people. How foolish. Well, it's at least theoretically conceivable that 20 more years of copyright on future works could increase the incentive to make them, but not for any rational author or artist, because any economist will explain to you that the discounted present value of 20 more years of copyright, say, starting 75 years in the future, which is what it starts, how much long it lasted before for works made for hire, for instance, that wouldn't rationally motivate anybody to do anything. It's too small. So the real motive for that law was simply to prolong the monopolies, the lucrative monopolies that some businesses already had. That's why we call it the Mickey Mouse Copyright Act. You see, Disney knew that the copyright on the film Steamboat Willie was going to expire in a few years. And that was the first film in which the character Mickey Mouse appeared. So when that film went, as it was supposed to go, into the public domain, that would mean everybody would be free to use Mickey Mouse in his own works. Well, Disney has got lots of benefit from the public domain, but does not believe that this should go in the other direction. In fact, Steamboat Willie was accused of being a cheap ripoff of Steamboat Bill. But nonetheless, Disney paid congressmen to vote for this law. That's how laws are decided on in the U.S. Congress sells them, basically. In a sort of indirect way, you know, it's money going to their campaign funds, or maybe they get clients after they leave office. Or there are various ways of paying them. And so they extended copyright for 20 more years. But that's just one temporary measure, because what the movie companies really want and say they want is perpetual copyright. But even they don't have the power to pass an amendment to the U.S. Constitution. So their plan is perpetual copyright on the installment plan. Every 20 years, they're going to extend copyright by 20 more years, which means that at any given time, any given work supposedly has a date when it will go into the public domain. But don't hold your breath, because that date is like tomorrow. It never comes. By the time you get there, they will have postponed it. That's the plan. They will always keep postponing it, and nothing will ever go into the public domain again. That's what they want. However, time is just one dimension. There's also the dimension of breadth. Which activities, which uses of a published work does copyright cover? Well, in the age of the printing press, it was not supposed that copyright would cover all uses of a published copyrighted work. The uses covered and restricted by copyright were the exception. However, the publishers think that digital technology offers them the opportunity to grab total control. They want to set up a pay-per-view universe. And they do this with digital restrictions management, or DRM. In other words, malicious features in various products designed to stop you from doing the things that you want to do. The public first encountered this in the form of DVDs. The video on a DVD is normally, in most cases, is stored in encrypted format. And the encryption method was secret. The idea being that it would stop people from ever figuring it out and ever making something unauthorized capable of playing a DVD. And in this way, they hoped they would permanently take away some of our legal rights to use published works. Now, this was set up by a conspiracy of companies intending to restrict the public's access to technology. it wasn't just one company doing all this. What the conspiracy said was anybody that wants to manufacture a DVD must join the conspiracy and promise that their DVD players will restrict the public just like all the other DVD players. This is why they all restrict people the same way. It's no accident. The conspiracy is doing this. Now, you might ask how I know. Well, it's not a secret. A conspiracy to restrict the public's access to technology should be punished by imprisonment like other conspiracies in restraint of trade. But these companies know that our governments are on their side against us. They have no fear that they will ever be prosecuted for attacking our freedom. So they don't even bother to keep their conspiracies secret. Some of these conspiracies have websites where they proudly announce how they're going to attack your freedom. So you must never accept any product designed to take away your freedom unless you personally have the means to defeat it. So never buy or rent a DVD or even accept one, well, never buy or rent an encrypted DVD, because there are a few that are not, or even accept one as a gift unless you personally have a copy of the free program which is capable of decrypting the video and therefore does not attack your freedom because it's a free program and you can change it. The secret of the encryption on DVDs was figured out in the 90s, and people wrote a free program capable of watching the video on a DVD. So the publishers started passing laws in many countries prohibiting the distribution of that software. Started, as so many other bad things do, in the US, especially attacks on people's freedom. In 1998, with the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, a thoroughly evil law, which establishes censorship of software in the US. So the free software to watch a DVD is forbidden. And anything that would enable you to break the digital handcuffs of the DVD player is forbidden. So the US government openly and clearly took the side of these companies against the public. And when there's a social problem in the US, of course, the US government doesn't try to correct it. Instead, it tries to impose it on the rest of the world. And in recent years, it's been trying to do this in Canada. And I'm glad to say that resistance has sprung up. First, there was the unjust bill C-60. And then there was the even more unjust bill C-61, which was also utterly absurd because any operating system would violate that law. So gnu+linux would violate it, Windows would violate it, Mac OS would violate it, and because they all have programs you can use to copy a file. And that's all it took. Well, I'm sure they're hoping that they can now bring back something less nasty and crazy than C-61 and pass it off as a fair, balanced bill. But balance is not what we want copyright law to do. Copyright law should serve the public interest, and purely the public interest, and only the public interest. That's the only interest that's relevant. Now, we have various interests, and we might want to balance some of them, but freedom is our most important interest. Copyright must respect the freedoms that we need. So fighting against C-62 is going to be up to you. In any case, the movie companies are well aware that despite these laws, which are extremely nasty, in France, the mere possession of a copy of this software is a crime. People could be imprisoned for having this piece of free software. Nonetheless, the software is circulating, and it's easy to get even in France, and lots of people have it. They know they will never be able to stuff that back in the can. So they have a follow-on system, which is called AACS, and I call it the axe, because it's meant to chop off our hands and our eyes, and when we need to give it the axe. So the AACS is their second generation digital restrictions management conspiracy, and according to its website, where they post the rules, or at least did, starting in 2011, manufacturers of players were not going to be allowed to make any analog video outputs. That shows how arrogant they are in the use of their power that they've got. You see, they refer to something called the analog hole, which they say they want to close. Let me show you a couple of analog holes that they want to plug. So that's part of the measures they're taking. They thought that nobody would ever break the axe, but they were wrong. About 2 years ago, somebody posted the algorithm, the program, to decrypt, but that was not censored because it was useless, because it didn't include the key, so it wouldn't actually run. It wouldn't actually do anything. But then somebody else posted the key. I found out about this when I saw a photo of two adorable puppies, and above them were 32 hex digits. And I wondered, why put these together? I wonder if this number is some kind of key that is that the government will try to censor, and someone put it together with these puppies, figuring people would share copies of the photo because the puppies are so cute. And thus, the number would be saved. And that's what it was. That was the key to break the axe. Unfortunately, that doesn't mean we've won this battle, because they just changed the key. And besides, that only enabled people to access HD DVDs. Blu-ray has another level of digital restrictions management, which I think nobody has broken. So certainly never use any Blu-ray discs. Pass the word. But we've seen digital restrictions management in other media as well. For instance, in music. Starting about a decade ago, we began to observe things that looked like compact discs, but they weren't really compact discs. They didn't follow the format. So we called them corrupt discs. And they were designed so that they would play in ordinary CD players, but you couldn't read them with a computer. Now, in many countries you can't tell that something is a corrupt disc, but there's some countries in Europe that require them to be labeled. They say you can't put the CD logo on, the compact disc logo on it, because it's not a valid compact disc. So they get labeled in a different way. Once, after I gave a talk on the same topic, my hosts gave me some records of music from the region, and one of them I really wanted to listen to, but fortunately before I opened the packet, I saw the symbol copy control. This disc can be played on Windows and Macintosh systems. That is to say, only with proprietary software that's unethical and I won't use. I won't have on my computer. So I gave it back and I said, here you see the face of the enemy. Please take this back to the store because they don't deserve to keep your money. I've never heard that music, and maybe I never will, but I'm not going to give up my freedom. Now, a few years ago, Sony got into a lot of hot water for its scheme for corrupt discs. Here's how it worked. The idea was that if you stick the disk into a computer, the disk would install some software on the computer. And that software was like the software found in a virus or the software that crackers use to take control of the machine. And that's what it was designed to do, take control of the machine. It inserted itself deep into the system where it restricted access to that disk. But it also altered the commands you would use to examine what's in the system so as to hide its own presence. More and more like a virus. And it also altered commands you might use to try to delete it so that they wouldn't do anything, more and more like a virus. Well, this is a serious crime. But that wasn't the only felony Sony committed, because this software also included code that had been released as free software, in fact, using the GNU General Public License. Now, that one particular free software license, it's not the only one, has the requirement that anytime you use that code in another program, you must distribute the entire program as free software under the same license, and you must offer the source code to the user, and you must provide the user with a copy of the license so that she gets to know her rights. Well, Sony didn't do any of that. It's another felony. But our governments were well aware that the purpose of these laws is to protect companies from citizens, not vice versa. So they weren't prosecuted, but people did sue Sony. Unfortunately, they focused their ire not on the fundamentally unjust aim that Sony had, but only on the secondary nasty things Sony did as part of the means. So Sony settled the suits, promising that in the future when it attacks our freedom, it won't do the other nasty things. Now, this scheme did have one redeeming characteristic, namely, the software only attacked Windows systems. So I suppose it wouldn't have caused any trouble to people reading the disks on gnu+linux. And even on a Windows system, you'd be safe if you remembered to hold down a certain key every time you put in one of those disks. Of course, it's hard to remember that all the time. And if you want freedom, you shouldn't be using Windows. Anyway, Sony has learned its lesson. In the future, their digital restrictions management rootkit. Rootkit means something that attacks the security of the system and takes control of it. It will be installed before you get the computer, and it will be impossible to remove, and it will be called the Axe. And that's what's already going on in the PlayStation 3, which you shouldn't buy under any circumstances. Well, it looks like digital restrictions management is on its way out in music. You know, Apple was one of the primary perpetrators of digital restrictions management, and they said they will stop it in music, but they'll keep doing it on other things. So maybe we've won this particular battle, the battle against DRM in music only. But we see a renewed attempt to impose DRM on books. Around 10 years ago, we saw a big push to convince people to use ebooks. This is part of the publisher's plan to take away the traditional freedoms of readers. Freedoms to do things like sell a book to a used bookstore, lend it to your friend, buy it anonymously, paying cash, borrow it from the public library, and even the freedom to keep the book for as long as you wish and read it as many times as you wish and pass it on to your heirs who might then do the same things. They want to take away all these freedoms, but there are millions of people that read books and would object. So, except in extremely undemocratic regimes such as the European Union, they lack these freedoms. Instead, they have a two-stage plan to do away with them. The first stage was to take away these freedoms for ebooks, and that they did in the US with 1998, and there was no resistance because there were no ebooks, and nobody was reading ebooks. So only a few of us recognized at the time how important, how harmful this law would be to our freedom. Most people were not being affected. The second stage of the plan was convince people to switch from printed books to ebooks. And they made a valiant effort to convince people. One publisher even thought that they could get their line of ebooks going with a bang if they started it with my biography. So they found an author, and he came to me and asked if I would cooperate, and I said, sure, if this book is published without encryption. The publisher wouldn't accept that. So I suggested a different publisher who did. In fact, the book was published under a free license, the GNU Free Documentation License, and it was published on paper, but also made available online. And it sold pretty well, although there are lots of errors in it. It's really sad. In any case, ebooks were a failure back then. People just didn't want to start reading them. They didn't accept them. But it was clear that the rejection was not because people valued those freedoms, but rather because of some kind of inconvenience. So I said, they're going to try again. We have to prepare to fight back again. It's characteristic of these companies that if they fail to take away your freedom on one attempt, they always try again. And now they are trying again. We see products such as the Sony Shredder. They call it the Reader, but it's more accurate to put on the SH in front. And the Amazon Swindle, which name is appropriate because people who buy it don't realize what it's doing to them. It's cutting them off from their friends. You know, friends lend books to friends. Somebody who starts reading ebooks through the Amazon Swindle is not going to lend you books anymore. Make sure your friends know in advance what it would mean if they were to start using that product, so that they won't fall into the trap by unawares. Then they're less likely to fall into it, and that product is less likely to hurt our freedom. Now, you should reject any product that has digital restrictions management that you personally don't have the means to break. But that's not enough. We have to fight back in an organized way, which is why the Free Software Foundation started a campaign of protests against DRM. You can find it in the site defectivebydesign.org. We need your help. Please go to the site and sign up and then participate in our protests. The mission we must achieve is to show megacorporations that if they design products to attack our freedom, they will be hated and that they will regret it. We need your participation in our protests to achieve this. And all of those attacks on our freedom are reinforced by laws like C60 and C61 and C62 and C63 and whatever it will be. Now, one of the justifications that Canadian politicians who wish to attack your freedom give for these laws is to carry out the requirements of the WIPO copyright treaty. Well, since the name WIPO uses the propaganda term, quote, intellectual property, unquote, you can guess that they're up to no good. And in fact, that treaty has no purpose except to require governments to take away freedom that their citizens should have. So the right thing for Canada to do with that treaty is unsign it. It's the only ethical thing it can do. So what would democratic governments that care about their citizens' freedom and interests be doing with copyright law? Well, they would be reducing this power that copyright gives certain people over the rest of us, certain people and a lot of companies, not necessarily eliminating it, but reducing it. But how? Here are my recommendations. First, there's the dimension of time. Instead of making copyright longer, we need to make it shorter again. I recommend 10 years starting from the date of publication. Why from the date of publication? Because before that, we don't have copies of the work. So we don't lose anything by not being allowed to copy the copies we don't have. We might as well let the author have as long as it takes to arrange publication. We're not losing anything. But why 10 years? Well, the publication cycle has been getting shorter and shorter. I don't know about Canada, but in the US, almost all books are remaindered within 2 years and out of print within 3. So 10 years is more than 3 times the usual publication cycle. That ought to be comfortably sufficient. But not everyone agrees. I once proposed this on a panel discussion with fiction writers, and an award-winning fantasy writer sitting next to me said, 10 years? That would be horrible. Anything more than 5 years is intolerable. Yeah, I was surprised too. When the publishers demand increased power over us, they say that they should get this power in the name of the, quote, creators, unquote, which is a propaganda term they use because it implicitly suggests that authors are deities and deserve to be bowed down to. That's why I call them authors and artists. I don't call them creators. In any case, they give the impression that increasing the power that they normally wield is good for all the authors and artists, but it's not. In fact, the same companies make a practice of grinding those authors into the ground with their heels. And this was an example. You see, this author, although he'd won an award, was not a best-selling author. And it looked like his book was out of print. Now, in his publication contract, he had a clause saying that if the book went out of print, the rights would revert to him. But the publisher refused to admit that the book was out of print and was using the copyright on his own book to stop him from distributing copies, which he wanted to do so people could read them. Isn't that amazing? His main wish was for people to read his work. That may surprise those of us who are used to focusing attention on a few superstars and ignoring everybody else. Every writer starts out wanting people to read his work. It's only a minority that get, like people like J.K. Rowling, that get corrupted by the money they get. Most of them don't get that kind of money, and they don't get corrupted, and they still want people to read their work. But in order to do that, he had to overcome the copyright on his own work. So he had a legal dispute with his publisher, and he realized that more than 5 years of copyright was not likely to ever do him any good. All it could do him was harm. Well, I don't insist it has to be 10 years. I wouldn't object to 5 years. I propose 10 years as a first whack at the problem. It's a rough estimate of what it should be. So let's try that. And a few years later, we could adjust it. If somebody proposed 9 years or 11 years, I'd still support the proposal. I don't know exactly what the best amount is, but I think it's in that order of magnitude. But also important is the dimension of the breadth of copyright power. Which activities should it cover? Well, there too we need to reduce it. But what I propose is not to treat all works the same. I think we should distinguish various categories of works not based on the medium, but rather based on the kind of contribution they make to society. And I distinguish 3 categories of different kinds of contribution. First of all, there are the works of practical use, the functional works, the works you use to do a job in your life. Second, there are the works of testimony, you might say, works whose contribution to society is they tell you what certain people thought. And third, there are the works of art and entertainment whose contribution is in the impact of the work itself. Now, I'm not judging one as more important than another. The point is that they're different, and they lead to different conclusions about which freedoms we must have. First, let's look at the practical functional works. These include software, recipes for cooking, educational works, reference works, text fonts, patterns for people to sew clothing. Anything that whose main important use is that you use it to do a practical job. These works must be free. And the reason is the same reasons that apply to software. Why software has to be free. Namely, if you use the work to do a job, then if you can't control what's in the work, you can't control your life. Freedom is having control of your own life. You must have the freedom to change the work. But then, for society's sake, you've got to be free to publish your version, because the same version that's better for you may be better for other people too. Some other people. Doesn't have to be everybody. Maybe some people would prefer the original version. Fine, they can use the original version. But your version, you should be free to make that available to other people too. But if you're free to publish modified versions, it doesn't work to restrict redistribution of the unmodified version. All it would do is make you make a modification that doesn't really have any effect. And that's ridiculous. So we must be free to redistribute with or without changes, and that basically makes it free. Now, 20 years ago, people might have raised the objection that the alarmist, panicky objection that if we don't let the authors restrict us and control us, they won't make these works, and that will be terrible. But now we can see that that's FUD. It's exaggeration. Because look at all the free software there is, you know, something like 10 or 20,000 free software applications. And then look at all the recipes that circulate basically as if they were free. And people still make recipes and still publish them. And then in the realm of reference works, we can see Wikipedia and other free licensed reference materials. Now, people looking at Wikipedia tend to get distracted by something that's ethically less important, which is the use of a wiki to write the text. Well, if that works well, and it seems to mostly, then fine, but that's not an ethical question. The ethical issue is about how you're free to use it. And in that case, it's published under a free license, the GNU Free Documentation License, which I wrote. At least for the moment it is. They might switch to a different free license, but it'll still be free. So don't accept inferior substitutes. Don't accept online reference works which don't come under a free license. And now the field of online textbooks that are free has been slower to take off, but it is starting to now. In fact, people set up a site, freetextbookproject.org, to list the free textbooks. There are enough of them now. And I hope that in 10 or 20 years there will be free textbooks for all the subjects anyone ever wants to study. So we don't have to be afraid. There's no need for that fear. There's no need to panic and give up our freedom. We should insist on the full 4 freedoms for all the functional, practical works. But what about the second category? Works that say what certain people thought. These include memoirs, essays of opinion, scientific papers, and various other things. Well, to publish a modified version of one of these works is simply to misrepresent someone else. And that's not a contribution to society. There's no particular reason it should be allowed. So I can propose a reduced copyright system in which commercial use of the work is covered by copyright and modification is covered by copyright. But everyone is free to non-commercially redistribute exact copies. That freedom, which makes the work not free but just shareable, is the minimum freedom that we must have for all published works. All published works must be shareable. I don't say that all published works must be free. Only in the first category do I say they must be free. But all works must be shareable, because that is what eliminates the oppressive nature of copyright today. The war on sharing is what makes today's copyright system evil. Well, giving people this minimum freedom to non-commercially redistribute exact copies ends the war on sharing. Sharing is the basis of society. To attack sharing is to attack society. And since most people sometimes want to share, the only way to prosecute the war on sharing is with cruel, draconian measures. For instance, suing teenagers for hundreds of thousands of dollars. And now there's a new plan which many governments are accepting, which is to punish people with disconnection from the internet after 3 accusations without any attempt to verify whether they were even true. So this violates a fundamental principle of justice, and yet it's being adopted in many countries. It shows how when you try to fight a war against something good like sharing, it warps all of society. And the damage goes very deep and far beyond the specific area of copying published works. So this reduced copyright system would function pretty much like the present one, and it would provide income to the authors in more or less the same inadequate way as the present one. Now, I say inadequate even though there are a few spectacular exceptions, but they're rare. Usually it functions inadequately. And the reduced one would function pretty much the same. So it would still be inadequate, but if we can suffer the present system's inadequacies, then it's unfair to raise that as an objection only to this reduced system. But what about the works of art and entertainment? Well, there it took me a few years to figure out what to think about publishing modified versions, because I see valid arguments on both sides. On the one hand, a work can have an artistic integrity, and modifying it could destroy that. And I think this is sometimes true, even though not as often as authors like to claim it's true. Just look at how so many of them allow Hollywood to completely butcher their work in exchange for enough money. But there are some who insist that Hollywood make something faithful to the work, and so those, I guess, do have artistic integrity, even if they've lost the other kind. So, okay, that is a valid argument. And by the way, I'm thinking in particular of J.K. Rowling, who obtained an injunction in Canada forbidding people who had purchased her books in a bookstore from reading them. This is why I call on people to boycott her books, specifically not to buy her books. I don't say you shouldn't read them. I leave that to her. I only say you shouldn't buy them. I'm not sure you should even buy them there. That does support the price of the new books. No, you should she shouldn't get the money. In any case, getting back to the main point, there are also arguments in favor of publishing modified versions. That can be a contribution to art. Consider, for instance, the folk process, where a series of people can transform a work and it can produce something very rich. But that usually involves people whose names we don't know. What about famous authors like Shakespeare? Well, some of Shakespeare's plays borrowed stories from other works that had been published just a few decades before. If today's copyright law had been in effect then, those plays would have been illegal and they wouldn't have been written, I suppose. And if Shakespeare or whoever had written those really wrote those plays were to have complained, the copyright holders would have said, he just wants to make a cheap ripoff of my great work. And since we would never have seen what it would have been, we would have had no firm basis to reject that claim. Since, in fact, those copyright law in the modern form didn't exist then, and those plays were written and published, we can say that they're important works of literature, but that's only because we got to see them. Well, eventually I recognized that publishing a modified version of a work of art can be a contribution to art, but usually there's no hurry about it. You could wait 10 years for the copyright to expire. So I can propose the same partly reduced copyright system where all commercial use and modified versions would last for 10 years or so, and then the copyright would expire, and then other artists could publish their modified versions of it. Now, we should distinguish between publishing a modified version of the work and using a little snippet as part of something else totally different. Now, that obviously should be permitted all the time, because the whole point of having any copyright system at all is to encourage writing and art. And it shouldn't get in the way of making these new, fundamentally different works. And the fact that in some countries, either way, right? The important thing is give the money directly and only to artists. And I mean all kinds of artists that are involved. You know, for music, I include composers as well as musicians, but not to companies. And the second point is, don't distribute, it has to be distributed based on the artist's popularity, not based on bureaucrats' decisions. But it should not be distributed in linear proportion, because linear proportion is an inefficient way to support the arts. Because suppose a superstar is 1,000 times as popular as some other pretty good and fairly popular artist. Well, linear proportion would give the superstar 1,000 times as much money. Well, which means that either the tax has to be very big and we're putting a lot of money into making superstars very rich, or else we're not giving enough to the fairly good, fairly successful artists to support them. So what I propose is instead, take the cube root. Take the raw popularity figures, take the cube root of them all, and distribute in proportion to that. That way our superstar gets only 10 times as much money as the fairly good, fairly popular artist. This way, well, you still get more as you get more successful, but not tremendously, insanely more. And as a result, most of the money being handed out will be going to support a large number of fairly good, fairly successful artists adequately. It will be an efficient system for promoting the arts, whichever arts we apply it to. Well, that's one proposal, and I know Canada has a scheme that is in some ways similar, but in several crucial ways different, and one of them is they haven't legalized copying and sharing, which is a crucial part of a crucial need. So they're trying to get you both ways. You know, they restrict you and they tax you. And I'm told that the money is not being distributed only to artists and certainly not being distributed in an effective division so as to support the arts well. But the other proposal, it doesn't involve taxation. It's a proposal for voluntary payments. Suppose that every player had a button which you could push in order to send $1 to the people who made whatever work you are currently enjoying or the last one you did. And you can push it if you like, and otherwise you don't. This, I think we now have evidence, would be a very effective way of supporting the arts. A lot of people want to pay voluntarily. In fact, we have seen that it's starting to work, even with today's inefficient and inconvenient payment systems that require people to have credit cards, for instance, and can't be used anonymously. For instance, it works well for famous groups such as 9 Inch Nails and Radiohead. They effectively released albums and said, buy a copy or share it. And they got hundreds of thousands of dollars. It also works for artists that are not so famous. Now, A year ago, I read about a Canadian singer named Jane Siberry, who I've also read had changed her name to Issa. I wonder if anybody knows why. Somebody guessed maybe this is because of some copyright dispute. But who knows, right? I don't have any facts. I'd never heard of her. Obviously, she's not that famous worldwide. I don't listen to much popular music, but I tend to at least have heard the names of the superstars, since I can't avoid it. But anyway, she, I read, sells copies of her recordings through her own website and lets people pay whatever they wish starting at $0. And the average amount she gets is more than $1, which is interesting because the major record companies charge a little under $1 for a download. So by respecting people's freedom, she's on the average getting more. And the only inefficiency involved is the inefficiency in the payment system, which might be considerable. Maybe she only gets half of what people pay. But that's better than a record company would do. So, and these are voluntary payments, and they're starting to work. A couple of weeks ago, I read Monty Python posted their videos for people to download, and sales multiplied by a factor of 200. Which again are in effect voluntary payments. So the system is starting to work even though it is done so badly. If we had a smooth, convenient system for voluntary payments, a lot more people would pay. Because what would make you hesitate to send $1? It's not that you, unless you're an economist, you're not going to begrudge anybody that dollar. Or unless you're poor. But, you know, there's no need for the poor people to pay to support the arts. There are plenty of non-poor people who will do it enough. So let the poor people not pay. So the big obstacle that discourages a lot of people from doing this is the inconvenience and the fact that it's not anonymous. If we had the right kind of system to do this, a lot more people would pay. I'm sure nobody here would mind pushing this button once a week or even once a day. The total amount of money you wouldn't miss. And if, in general, we wanted people to increase their support for the arts, we could have a warm, kind, friendly PR campaign saying, have you sent $1 to a band this week? Why not do it? You love the music, it's only $1, push the button. And this would be effective because it works with human nature. People feel good when they send some money to artists. It would work far better than the cruel and vicious PR campaigns now that tell people that sharing is theft or sharing is attacking ships, that to help your neighbor is evil. Campaigns that most people know in their hearts are evil lies, but that not all that many people dare to denounce as such. Well, I hope that my speeches will get people going, denouncing those lies, rejecting them completely. Now, I brought with me various things to sell on behalf of the Free Software Foundation, but I'm not allowed to sell them here. So we're doing it by email. I've got some copies of my book of essays, Free Software, Free Society. And I also have lapel pins for the GNU and the Free Software Foundation, and key rings. The books are $25, the lapel pins are $12, the key rings are $18. And there are also some large buttons that say, ask me about free software. It's all about freedom. And those are $5. So if you want one, where should you send email?
I'll write it on the board.
Okay, and you better send it soon
Before
because...
3 o'clock.
Yes, because, and in particular, I also have one hardcover copy of Free Software, Free Society, which is being auctioned off. So email your bid to this name. I hope you'll write it on both sides, and then it'll be claimed by the highest bid. The minimum price for that is $40. And this money will all go, none of it will go to me because I'm an unpaid volunteer, but it will go to the Free Software Foundation, which campaigns to defend your freedom. For instance, the people who run defectivebydesign.org are supported by this. So now I will ask for questions.
Could you elaborate more about how J.K. Rowling had requested that more?
Well, a store made the mistake of putting them on sale before the date it was supposed to. So the store made a mistake, and if she had sued the store, that might be legitimate. I wouldn't complain, but that wasn't enough for her. She got an injunction literally forbidding the people who had bought those books to read them. And that, I think, is a monstrous outrage.
Who will the transition phase? Just copyright down to say 10 years. There's a gap in between. There are a lot of people who have done work for hire and who have agreed to get payment slowly, such that after they've done a lot of work,
Well, actually, no. People who've done work for hire got paid at the time they were working on it, and they don't expect to get paid anymore.
But some of these agreements have payments that are very slow.
I think that's a side issue. We'll have to do something about it, and whatever it might be, it's not important enough to hold up this important change.
The government of Canada just recently released a relation RFI for on what they call no charge license software. So it's a request for information.
Interesting. Could you, well, we should probably have somebody talk to them about free
And that's what I'm
software,
asking.
which
Who
are
should we
those.
ask for? Who can we get them to provide?
Oh, well, if you say mail to me, RMS, he says the government of Canada asked for information on, quote, no charged licensed software, unquote, which does not necessarily mean it's free software, but it includes free software.
It
So,
actually does specify open source software.
well, open source is not the same as free software, but yeah. Anyway, email me, right? Here's not the place for me to discuss it, but this is important, so thank you for bringing it up. Send me email, rms@gnu.org, and I will get people together to give them an answer. By the way, some of you may have heard the term open source and not know how it differs from free software. Basically, in the 1990s, there was a split in the free software community between those of us who really cared about freedom and those who were only interested in powerful, convenient software, which the gnu+linux system happened to be. And so in 1998, the latter group coined the term, quote, open source, unquote, so that they could talk about the same software but never raise the ethical issues of freedom and community that concerned us. Well, a lot of people are motivated by that term to develop programs that are free. And what they're doing is still an ethical thing, and it's a contribution to our community. I'm not going to reject a program because the developer of the program didn't care about freedom, but I do reject their views, and that's why I never accept open source as a term that relates to me. Now, what your views are is up to you, but now at least you know that you can advocate free software or you can advocate open source, and these are fundamentally different philosophies based on different values. So you have an important choice to make if you're concerned with those things.
Just a quick, first we talked about, for the 10-year copyright term, we talked about different things for the different kinds of works. I wondered, do you think it's feasible for different media types? Do you think it's
I don't see a reason to distinguish based on media types, but, I wouldn't necessarily object.
The second quick part on with software specifically, you talked about the freedom to modify. Do you think, would your vision mean that for proprietary software, the source would have to be excluded because the freedom to
Well, I don't think there should be any, he's asking, does this mean that for proprietary software, the source should be made available to the users? Well, what I believe is that all software should be free, so there should be no proprietary software. But yeah, software is an unusual case because copyright is not the only way that software is made proprietary. In fact, it's not the main way. Although it does forbid people to copy and modify software. But the main thing they use for that is contracts and user license agreements. And they also use the technique of not releasing the source code at all to the users, which isn't a legal technique, but it has the same effect of keeping the users helpless. And also, they have another technique, TiVoization, which is the practice of building a device so that if you install modified software into it, it shuts down. So free software means none of these things is being done. Just eliminating copyright on software would not make all software free. So that's why what I say is I think all those works should be free. I don't say all those works should have no copyright, which is not the same thing. What matters is that they should be free.
So do you say that should be made technically be included in law, or sort of that this is technically correct?
Well, I'm not sure. And the reason is that prohibiting something lots of people want to do is a really bad thing. Whatever it might be, even, as we saw in the US, prohibiting alcohol was a really bad thing, whether you ever want to get drunk or not. And today, of course, there's prohibition of a lot of other drugs, and it's a bad thing, a very bad thing. To prohibit proprietary software in a society where most people are not against it would be a bad thing. But I hope eventually we'll have a world in which most people understand that you have to be crazy to trust a proprietary program. They have no security against their developers. And their developers, in many cases, have shown that they're willing to do any nasty thing to you that they can get away with. You'd have to be crazy, or else have your eyes shut, to use Microsoft Windows or Mac OS.
Can I ask you a question about software standards? Suppose we accepted the ideals that you proposed, and we all are behind you 100%. How do we get out of this world where either we have to play by the rules or we're incompatible?
Oh, wait a second. You seem to be assuming that free software follows standards less than proprietary software, but I think it's just the opposite.
No, my point is that sometimes standards might be proprietary.
Well, but we shouldn't allow that, obviously. A standard that people are not free to implement and use is an outrage, inherently. But in general, you should note that free software tends to follow standards because users tend to want that. And if you make a free program that doesn't follow a relevant standard, the users are likely to change it to follow the relevant standard unless there's some very good reason for not following it. And they're free to do so, so they will. And because we know that, we anticipate them. We don't put in something that we know everybody's going to want to change. We follow the standard. On the other hand, companies like Microsoft often choose to make something totally incompatible because they think that the incompatibility and lack of interoperability is to their advantage. And they think they're powerful enough to make everybody else swallow it.
So just to clarify, you would prohibit those kinds of practices?
Which kind of practices?
To make proprietary standards?
Well, yeah, I think that must not be allowed, but how does a standard get to be proprietary? Well, either through secrecy or through a patent. Now, people should, of course, if a communications protocol or file format is secret, that means whatever program that's available to you that supports it is non-free because the source code, if you could have it, would tell you what the format was. So if you know better than to use non-free software, you won't be using a secret format. On the other hand, countries that allow software techniques and activities to be patented are doing something extremely foolish, but this is not the place to discuss that because here I'm talking about copyright law and patents are a totally different subject.
Yeah. Okay. Like you're arguing that we should sort of opt out of this proprietary ownership, basically because they're deliberately erecting barriers that.
Well, we should do so. We should opt out from proprietary software, as I have already done, because I want to live in freedom and I want to be free to cooperate with you.
Okay. I mean, that seems to be like the ethical basis, but I think one of the arguments that the proprietary software usually has is that because they're more centralized or profit earning and they're larger, they can create different kinds of software that more decentralized.
Yes, the arguments that they make is that by restricting us and exploiting us, they will get the money with which maybe they can make software that is better in a purely technical sense or purely practical sense. But it's always worse in terms of freedom, and therefore I don't want it anyway. So I'll never be a user for it. So I don't see any good in its existence. I would rather it not exist. I would rather that all the proprietary software projects in the world came to a halt because they're only available to people who give up their freedom. They're not available to me. And not only that, they tend to occupy space that free software might otherwise move into. The people who don't care about their freedom and use the proprietary software, they're in effect being used. They're not just giving up their own freedom, but in many cases it's worse than that, and they get used as an obstacle to anyone who wants to live in freedom. There are many products, for instance, that will only work with Microsoft Windows. There are sites that will only work with Microsoft Windows. This is a very dangerous thing. And so I want those projects to stop. I don't think that there's any good in making a program that is technically better but ethically worse. I don't want to encourage that. I hold with the principle that it's good to reward activities that make the world a better place and punish those that make it a worse place. And that means we should reward people who develop free software and punish those who develop proprietary software.
The three different levels of copyright that you kind of put forward seem to mimic what Leslie has done under the Creative Commons project and the licenses he has. With one main exception being that obviously you can't add a comment to the Creative Commons licenses. Do you find pushing the CC license to be acceptable stuff?
Well, he's asking basically how Creative Commons relates to what I've talked about. Well, Creative Commons publishes licenses, and that's all it does. And then copyright holders can apply those licenses to works. Well, if you look at those licenses, you'll see that two of them qualify as free. And so those are good for use on functional, practical works, except for software. For software, you should use the GNU General Public Licenses, would be better. But for, say, encyclopedias and textbooks and so on, it's okay to use one of those two free Creative Commons licenses. The other present-day Creative Commons licenses are not free licenses, but they're shareable licenses. So they're all okay for use on art and works of opinion, and I sometimes use them. What Creative Commons does not do is advocate anything. So although Lessig says that Creative Commons was partly inspired by the free software movement, this is a fundamental difference at the level of philosophy. They don't say that all works should permit this.
Do you see it as like a violent stopgap until
Creative Commons, I see Creative Commons releasing things under appropriate licenses is something that we can do now and something that is our ethical obligation to do. But that will not get us the freedom to share other works, which is a freedom we deserve. That we're going to have to get by overcoming the forces that control our governments today.
I have a question about intellectual property in general. And I guess was here would accept that there's been economic downfall in the last 6 months, years. And a lot of governments, for example, Alberta, have been betting on using technology, information technology, whatever, to increase their economy, make some money. And for example, in Alberta, there's a lot of funds to help the computing sector grow. I was wondering how do you see lawmakers reacting to the claims you're making, given that the government wants to promote patents, development, and information technology?
Well, first of all, the government of Alberta has nothing to do with copyright or patent policy or trademark law. And so, these various totally disparate laws that some people foolishly lump together are beyond the control of the government of Alberta, but also they have nothing to do with each other. So we shouldn't talk about all of them as if they made some kind of sense to talk about together. Now, there are some ethical things businesses can do in the computing field, and there are also unethical things that they can do. I'm more concerned with whether they respect our freedom than with how successful they are. And I think that any government that focuses more on supporting business in its own territory than on the freedom of its citizens is a traitor government. And those governments are effectively for sale. They've sold out completely.
I'm wondering what your thoughts are on how governments define and deal with media piracy, especially with media that doesn't necessarily have any free options available.
Well, the term piracy, when applied to sharing, is propaganda. What they're trying to say is to share with your neighbor is the moral equivalent of attacking a ship. And morally speaking, nothing could be more wrong than that, because attacking ships is very bad, but helping your neighbor is good. So you shouldn't use their propaganda terminology. The fact that they use it reflects that they have taken the wrong side, namely the side against the public in this dispute. And they're trying to brainwash people into thinking that sharing is wrong.
So I'm trying to formulate a question based on my 3 lines of notes. And I think when it comes down to it, what product is it possible or conversely not possible to steal?
Well, as far as I know, only a physical object can be stolen. You might, something that is an abstraction, and that might include, for instance, shares in a company. I don't see how you can, if that's not a physical object, you might swindle somebody out of it, but I don't know how you can steal it. Certainly there's no way to steal a copyright.
So I'm thinking more along the lines of, I sold it to me, but it's broken. But yet I feel that somebody, when some effort to produce it, they deserve some compensation.
Well, I don't believe that they deserve compensation. That is an irrelevant concept. Now, the time that somebody deserves compensation is if he's working for you. And then he probably won't, well, if you're a hospital, he might agree to work for you for nothing. But if you're a business, he'll probably demand to get some pay, and then he deserves to get paid. Well, I'm all in favor of that. But I don't think that a record company deserves compensation for anything. Now, if they have records on sale, those things could be stolen, and I'm not going to steal them. So I expect I'll pay to get a record in the record store. But that's as far as it goes. Now, no, absolutely not. Artists have no entitlement to being paid because somebody enjoys their art, and I reject the application of the term, quote, compensation, unquote, in this context. On the other hand, supporting the arts is a good thing to do. I would like to support artists more. I wish it were easier for me to do so. And I'm perfectly happy when I do support an artist. But that's a very different thing from saying that they're entitled to a payment because I appreciated some art. That I reject. I often borrow books from people. I often hear them playing some music. I don't believe I owe a debt to anybody, and any attempt to establish a requirement for me to pay them for the enjoyment I got is an outrage. And you'll note that talk about, quote, compensation, unquote, tends to go with mention of, quote, rights holders, unquote. In other words, they give us a bait and switch. They talk about supporting artists, and then they turn it into paying the record companies what we supposedly owe them. So any good system for supporting the arts through tax funds has to start by rejecting this concept of, quote, compensating right holders, unquote. I can't hear you very well.
Further to that, it's important to acknowledge that we're only starting to enter a realm where we're able to do that in a decentralized way. The idea of commissioning artists to create a work, to basically establish a relationship where you've agreed compensation for somebody's creation of a work, or where you're promising a reward for the creation of that work. In the past, it was based on a system that forced censorship and forced choices by people who had the money as to what kind of works were going to be created. And until now that's become decentralized enough that it can be supported by those who consume the media post-production.
Oh, we don't consume art, however. What you said is very general, and I think I mostly agree with it. It's hard for me to be sure. But I don't like the idea of speaking of, quote, consumers, unquote, of music or literature or so on, because one of the nice things about these works is that they are not consumed by using them.
I think the concern that I was expressing is just that in the current system works on contract, that somebody sells the creation that they made to somebody else who markets it, who reaps profit.
Yeah.
But in the past, when works, like when there had been a promise to pay somebody for a product that they were going to make, create a product.
I'd rather not call it a product, but yes, there was before mass publication, what we saw was a system where artists would get commissioned by some patron, and the patron would just pay the artist and would have the work.
But it's scary to bias that that can produce.
It's scary. What?
It's scary to think about the bias that could have been produced.
Maybe so, but that's a very different issue. And there are many ways we support the arts. I proposed a couple, and of course patrons do support arts now.
Richard, you talked about support incentives for the arts. You talked about both donations by individuals and some form of government sponsorship. Would you extend that scheme to software? Like specifically, I'm thinking of games where they come and stop the borderline between.
Okay, let me respond for time's sake because I understand the issue. So he's talking about, can we support computer games with those things? Well, a computer game may be a combination of a software package and some art. And if the publisher splits them, then it's okay to treat the software as software and the art as art. So yeah, this art could be supported. Well, the problem with supporting software development, though, through taxation, is it's hard to decide who gets how much, because anybody else could be making a modified version, and often there are hundreds of people who've contributed. How do you judge whose contribution is worth how much, unless they negotiate it with each other? But that would be very hard too. In the plan that I'm proposing, there usually won't be so many contributors to a work of art, especially not one that's copyrighted, because it will still, in the proposal I made, people still will be allowed to publish modified versions of it during that period. So I think it will work to identify who to give the money to. Now, with the voluntary payment scheme, I guess whoever published the version of the program could set the payments to go to him, and there's no dishonesty there and no great obstacle, but you might really rather send your money to somebody else who wrote the bulk of the program rather than the person who made the last change. So it's a bit harder there, but maybe could still be done. Well, you know, I hesitate to draw any conclusions about anything as broad as capitalism. Well, what I would say is, though, that this is something more specific than capitalism as such. He asked, does the exploitation we see through copyright indicate that capitalism is growing?
Not specific capitalism, just
Well,
maybe
capitalism may be broken, but I wouldn't reach that conclusion just based on these exploitative and oppressive copyright practices. Nowadays, we've got somewhat more reason to think that something in our system is more generally broken. What I would say it comes from is political power of business. That's the common element we can see in the financial crisis and in the oppressive use of copyright law. Businesses with political power have used it to take control of our governments and use them against us. And this suggests to me that we should prohibit companies from being large enough to exercise any significant political power. It's so large that if you would consider it a disaster if it moved to a different country, that it shouldn't have been allowed to exist in the first place, for instance. I just read that there was a report that Nokia demanded an unconstitutional law in Finland and said, if you don't pass this, we'll move to another country. So the elected representatives all said, oh, we consider this constitutional. If there is a company that could make such a threat effectively, it must be broken down into pieces that are too small to make such a threat. Yes, but 3D print, I said for the most part. Yes, 3D printers exist, but most of us don't have them. So that may change, you know. In 100 years, there may be nanotechnological disassemblers and assemblers. We may be able to copy everything, even people. And there's some enjoyable science fiction books about that. It may happen. Not only that, but in India, apparently, there are copiers for furniture. They're human, but apparently their labor is so cheap that the cheapest way to get furniture is to say to somebody, please make a copy of this. Well, if in India copying furniture is feasible, then it's an important issue. People have got to be allowed to copy furniture. But that's not the case here. Here, that would be so ridiculously expensive that nobody would ever think about it. If you wanted to spend that much money, you would commission a beautiful, different piece of furniture rather than copying. Stowe was a minor threat. I always say it was a minor threat. The real danger comes from laws that censor free software. That is, the real threat to free software comes from laws that censor free software. Laws like the Digital Millennium Copyright Act and also yes, this is the book that we're auctioning.
$60 as at 11:48.
So at that point, the highest bid was $60. You can now send in a higher bid to this address.
As quickly as possible, please.
Well, at 3 o'clock, we'll check for the highest bid at that point.
So we have a class coming in here. I'll be brief. If you're looking at
Sorry.